Just a note before this episode. The following interview contains adult themes and the recounting of traumatic events. Listener discretion is advised. Rebecca Zahau was in the bathroom when she heard a bang. It sounded like a crash or a dog barking. It was July 11, 2011, and the 32-year-old was caring for 6-year-old Max Shacknai, the son of her 54-year-old boyfriend, Jonah Shacknai. And the bathroom Rebecca was in was no ordinary bathroom. It sat inside a 27-room home called Spreckels Mansion in Coronado, California. Spreckels Mansion was the holiday residence of Jonah, a millionaire and CEO of a successful pharmaceutical group. Coronado is an affluent resort city in a peninsula in San Diego Bay, with coastlines as far as the eye can see and streets marked by well-manicured lawns and tall palm trees. Rebecca had been dating Jonah for 2 years when she heard the bang, startling her enough that she ran towards it. What she saw would set off an unthinkable chain of events, ultimately leading to the loss of 2 innocent lives. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast looking into the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In this episode, I'm speaking with Derrick Levasseur, a retired police sergeant and licensed private investigator from Rhode Island in the United States. Derrick has received multiple awards, including the Medal of Valor, which is the highest honour a police officer can receive. Derrick is also a private investigator who researched the case of Rebecca Zahau. 2 deaths would divide investigators and law enforcement, and the tragic story is one that had one outcome in the criminal court, and a very different finding was reached when the case was brought before a civil court. I want to begin on the morning of July 11 when a woman named Rebecca Zahau heard a bang inside the house she was in. What was it?
Well, it ended up being her stepson, Max Shacknai. There's some speculation as to how that all occurred, but she ended up finding him in the foyer area on the ground. The chandelier had broken as well. His Razor scooter was near his body, and he was unresponsive at that time.
And what do we know otherwise about the state she discovered him in? So you say he was unresponsive. Was he breathing? What sort of visible injuries did he have?
He did have some visible injuries. I believe he had a visible injury to his face area. It was later determined that that was most likely caused by the hand railing leading down the stairs. I do not believe he was breathing at that point. I believe he was completely unresponsive. If there was a pulse, she wasn't able to obtain it at that point. It's all important to note that also her younger sister was there as well. She was 14 years old. I'm not going to say her name unless you're going to say it. I, in the show, kept her name out of the show for that reason. I don't feel she was as relevant. I didn't want to drag her into something. But I know that they immediately called 911. Max did not die at the scene. He died later in the hospital. So I would assume he had some type of pulse and breathing at that point. But she didn't relay any of that to 911, I don't believe. She just called in as an unresponsive young male.
And as you say, she was the stepmother in a relationship with Max's biological father.
Jonah. That's right.
Can you tell us a little bit about Jonah?
Jonah was in pharmaceuticals. He was a very, very successful businessman, made millions. Where they were located, they had multiple homes, but Spreckels Mansion was located in a part of the country, San Diego, that is very affluent community. Only the most successful, the most richest live out there. And not only did the most successful live out there, but in that particular mansion, the Spreckels Mansion was one of the best houses on that island. So he was very well off, very successful. And from what we learned, he was someone who was a good guy, but also someone who was cutthroat when he needed to be. And in that type of industry, I think a lot of guys are. So respected, but I'm sure feared at some points as well. Not physically, but just because of the presence he brought with the amount of power he had.
And how long had he been in a relationship with Rebecca?
That's a great question. I know that he met her in Arizona. She was a dental assistant. She eventually moved out to California with him, and they did marry.
But obviously it was long enough for him to feel very comfortable with her caring for their son.
Yeah, absolutely.
Her stepson.
They were married, but it was learned through our investigation that the relationship at that point was not necessarily on the best terms. There was a journal entry found by investigators from Rebecca, and it spoke about how she wanted children. And it didn't appear that Jonah wanted that, and that she felt like he was growing distant from her at that point. And this is before Max's incident. So there was some things going on that she wasn't satisfied with. She wanted more out of the relationship, but yet they were married and they were still together. So yes, of course, he trusted her to supervise his child while he wasn't home. I believe he was playing tennis.
And you interviewed some of Rebecca's friends, and
Yes.
they gave you a picture of what sort of person she was. What do we know about who she was?
Well, Rebecca was a great girl. She was someone who was full of life, very nice to everyone she met, would always give people the shirt off her back if she had to. They always felt like she was the light of the party. She was always the light of the room. The only issue that I came across with those interviews was the fact that they knew her mostly from when she was in Arizona. People change, lives change. And again, for me, I have to come from an objective angle. I have to look at the facts and look at the most relevant information. And although they definitely did not think she killed herself, they said that was absolutely impossible. The word suicide and Rebecca did not even mix, and they were emphatic about it. Even after we gave them our opinions, they disagreed with them. And I respect that completely. But they're basing their opinions off of the woman they knew, I believe it was 2 or 3 years prior to her moving to California.
And that day when 911 was called and they obviously came to the scene, Max was rushed to hospital. What do we know about what his condition was like when he arrived? What did doctors say?
I think it was very bad from the beginning. He was in a coma. I've seen the photos. It was not under good circumstances. I don't believe Rebecca went to the hospital initially. It was Jonah. We did learn later that there was a phone call made by Jonah Shacknai to Rebecca Zahau shortly after the doctors came in and gave an update on Max, and that update was not good. It was that he was going to have some serious neurological conditions if he was going to make it at all. He would never be the same. So I don't know what was said on that phone call, but shortly after that is when they believe whatever happened to Rebecca was what transpired.
What did Max's biological mother, who I believe lived quite close.
Yeah, I interviewed her.
Yeah, what did she think about what had happened? Did she have a theory?
Dina's a great person. Dina, I give her so much credit for being willing to go on camera and speak about it and continue to push Max's story. They have a thing called Maxie's House, and they raise money and they do a lot of things to keep his name alive. As far as what she thought about what happened to Max, she does not think that Max's death was an accident. She thinks there's more to the story. I didn't find anything to substantiate that. I didn't get the impression that she felt that Rebecca had anything to do with Max's death either. But again, she's someone who is, she hired outside consultation people, pathologists. She did hire physicists to come in and try to recreate the scene and how Max would have fallen if he did go over the railing the way police believe he did. And it just doesn't line up. She thinks there's someone out there who had something against Jonah due to his previous business dealings and may have decided to get to Jonah through the people he loved. Now, I have to go on record and say that this is all speculation. There's nothing been proven. None of this is what I personally believe. This is what Dina has told me, but she was very emphatic about the fact that she doesn't believe Adam had anything to do with Rebecca's death or Max's death for that matter. He wasn't even in San Diego at the time.
There was an expert who suggested that it does appear that Max was riding his scooter upstairs just before the accident took place, but the upstairs of the house was carpeted.
Correct.
And she suggested that it would have been very difficult to sort of be using a scooter there at all. What did you find about some of the evidence that she put forward to you two?
So here's the thing. Do you have children?
No.
Okay. I have 2 children. Just because you're not supposed to ride a scooter on the carpet doesn't mean they don't. And I can tell you that not as a detective, but as a parent. My kids do whatever they're not supposed to do on the inside of the house. So is it possible that he could have been riding a scooter on the carpet? Absolutely. I think more what she was focused on is the amount of speed he would have been able to generate from riding that scooter on the carpet. And I would agree with her that it wouldn't be that much. But there was a lot of other pieces of evidence left behind that was strongly suggestive that the scooter did in fact hit the railing at that moment at some level of acceleration. There was a chip that was perfectly aligned with the height of the scooter in the railing. There was paint transfer from the banister on the scooter itself. And the thing that's interesting is everyone always assumes that when you're talking about this scooter going over the railing, you're talking about it as if he went over the top of the railing. But what we're failing to realize, unless you see it, is that the area where the chip in the banister was directly also in line with where the stairs were. So in reality, what could have happened is that his front wheel of the scooter started to go down the stair. And what happens with a railing going down a set of stairs, it's a lot lower. It's a 45, 50-degree angle. So he wasn't going directly over, because that was the big argument. He wouldn't have been high enough. Center of gravity would have been too low. No way he could have gone over the railing. That's probably true. But if he was not paying attention, looking around, maybe Rebecca was telling him to get off the scooter, and he happened to look back, and when he looked forward, his front wheel went over the first step of the stairs. Well, now the center of gravity needed to go over that railing is a lot less. And that is what I believe. That's what the conclusion that I ended up coming to. Everything about the physics of it supported Max going over that railing while being on a scooter. The San Diego County Sheriff's Department also, they came out, they concluded the same thing. They recreated it. It all lined up to me. There was nothing really that stood out that would be suggestive that what was said happened didn't happen.
911, where's your emergency?
I sprinted into the house and saw Max laying on the floor.
When I first saw him, he had tubes, coming out of every orifice in his body. For any parent, you see your son like that, I just thought, wow.
You'll remember investigators call Max's death an accident. They believe Max died after he fell over the railing, hitting the chandelier and then the floor. Dina says that doesn't sound like her son, telling the magazine he was not a daredevil.
And the day after that horrific accident, obviously, Jonah's in hospital and his ex-wife, the mother of Max, is in hospital. What was Rebecca doing? Because there were family coming in and
That's
stuff,
right.
weren't there?
That's right. She was mostly at the house. I do believe she went and picked up Adam Shacknai at the airport. She was kind of serving as the liaison. She went and picked up Adam, brought him back to the house. She was making phone calls. Obviously, she was not in a good place at that point, as any woman would be, or any man for that matter would be. I think it's safe to say that she was the one watching him. This happened on her watch. I don't know her mindset at that point, but obviously she was the one put in charge of taking care of him. So I think any of us would feel the same way and feel very terrible about what happened.
And what kind of person was Adam?
Adam Shacknai, very limited that I know about him. I know he was a former tugboat captain, kind of a cocky guy from the interviews I saw, very brash, kind of wears his heart on his sleeve, just willing to say whatever he wants to say. You see it in his interviews. This guy is being implicated in a possible murder, and he didn't care. He would just say what he thought, right off the top of the or whatever came to his mouth at the time he said it. Probably not the best course of action when you're under investigation like that, but as far as his background, nothing out of the ordinary. From what I understand, he doesn't have like a serious criminal past, nothing that would stand out that would be suggestive of him being capable of doing something like this. Doesn't mean he didn't. There's been many people who have committed crimes like this, crime of passion, where in that moment your emotions take over and you commit a crime like this. But nothing that stood out to me that would suggest, this is someone who has a particular past that would be suggestive of this. We had Dr. Chris Mohandi on that episode as well, a world-renowned criminal psychologist, and he didn't see anything in his past either that would be suggestive of it.
He stayed the night. I believe he was staying in a guest house or something that was part of that enormous house.
Mm-hmm.
And he woke up early the next morning to go and get coffee and saw a scene involving Rebecca. What did he come across that morning?
So there's kind of like this general courtyard between the guest house and the main house. And as you're walking across, the back corner of the main house would have been one of the bedrooms. It wasn't the main master bedroom of Rebecca's house. A lot of people get that confused as well. They always say, it was the master bedroom that Jonah and Rebecca slept in. It wasn't. It wasn't their main bedroom. So I'm going to be, I don't know how descriptive you want me to be about this, but Rebecca was hanging by a red rope over the balcony from that bedroom. She was completely naked. Her hands were bound behind her back, and her feet were also bound by rope.
And what did Adam do when he saw this scene?
Well, according to Adam, he went inside and he grabbed a knife came out, there was a small table, like a patio table outside. He pulled the patio table underneath her. He stood up on it. He immediately cut her down, and he called the police. And that recording has been played many times on many different shows, many different podcasts, where he calls police and basically tells them, hey, listen, I have this woman here. I don't even think he said her name or who she was. And when they asked for the address, he didn't really know it. He had to run out and find it. I don't know if he said that he had given her any type of resuscitation or anything, but I do believe he just said, oh, she hung herself. I'm just trying to get her down. We need to get someone here fast.
Was there anything suspicious in that call? You say that he did in the call refer to her as girl or woman or something, but didn't say her name, which maybe if they weren't particularly close, he wouldn't have called her by name. But was there anything that raised suspicion about his first movements?
For me, no. And I got to be honest with you. A lot of your listeners may disagree with me. This is one of the cases where my ultimate conclusion is not in line with the popular opinion. And it's just because I went with the facts. It's not what you know, it's what you can prove. And there was nothing in what he said to me that was suggestive of him deceiving them. I try to think if I put myself in that situation, he wasn't very close with Rebecca. It didn't mean he didn't know who she was. He clearly did. But in that moment, when you see something that traumatic, I think a lot of people may do things that they don't normally do. So there wasn't any quote unquote red flags for me in that conversation. It didn't seem very scripted, like this was premeditated, this phone call. It seemed like it was a spur of the moment. He was out of breath. So to me, it felt genuine. It doesn't mean it was, but that's the impression that I got.
An emergency, what are you reporting?
Yeah, I got a girl hung herself. It's on Ocean Boulevard across from the hotel, same place that you came and got the kid yesterday.
Okay, sir, is she still alive?
I don't know.
Okay. Sir, are you there?
Are you alive? Oh. Hello?
Is she beyond help?
Well, give me some. I'm compressing her chest right now.
Okay, listen to me. Help is coming right now, okay?
And when the police arrived, there was a discovery of words that had been written on the wall, like a message that had been left. Can you recall sort of what that message said and why it was so confusing?
I believe it was, she saved him. Can you save her? I believe that was it. She saved him. Can you save her? And that's like this big, that's what makes this story so fascinating, right? Because that's where the subjectivity comes in. That's the argument that will probably go on for as long as you and I are alive, because there are people who believe she wrote that and there are people who believe her killer wrote that.
Because it's in the third person. She's not referring to herself, which is what's very strange. If it was something that she'd written before she decided to die by suicide, then you would think that it would be in first person. But that's what is sort of discussed in the documentary, is that it's almost like a riddle. It's almost like a riddle. It's definitely something that is perplexing. You also have to take into consideration that it wasn't written in what is known to be her handwriting. She had very nice handwriting. This was kind of just like block writing. You also have to take into consideration that it was written at a level that wouldn't be in line with her eyesight. It was still possible for her, but she would have had to essentially like reach up and write it. It was above her natural height. So all these little variables, they could be red herrings, or they could be suggestive of who the killer was. So if you're in the camp that believes that she was killed, you're going to go towards, it wasn't her handwriting. It was at a height that wouldn't be natural for her. It's written in a third person. This was a note to Jonah from the killer to tell him, I got her. But then you start to break down the actual message itself. She saved him. Can you save her? Well, if you're about to kill her, you didn't save her. There's no way you can save her. She's already dead. And at that point, I don't know if the killer would have known if he saved her or not. Meaning Max. That's how I interpret the message. She saved him, meaning Max. How would the killer have access to that information unless it was Adam? And at that point, I don't think they thought he was going to survive. I think the people closest to Max and Jonah all kind of knew from what the doctors had recently told Jonah the night before that the prognosis was not good. And in the next couple of days, Max did die.
Correct.
And there were some notes in the assessment by a doctor that were unusual in terms of what they thought the cause of that death was. There was one suggestion that it was almost suffocation.
Right.
What did you make of that?
Yeah, we did look into that, and it was due to the injuries that he sustained during the fall. You can break your neck and suffocate. You absolutely can. I'm not a pathologist, so I'm not going to sit here and dive into the details of it. That's why we have those people on our show. The overview, just from what we gathered, is that it's completely possible to suffer a traumatic injury from a fall like that. You're falling, and I always hate to talk about it when it involves children, but the belief is that he not only struck the chandelier, he struck the railing of the stairs and then struck the floor. And he had injuries to support that, and severe injuries. And that could have caused the suffocation where he wasn't able to breathe because of the injuries he sustained. If you break your neck, you can lose oxygen to your brain very quickly without anybody physically suffocating you.
So it would appear that Rebecca is aware that they're really serious injuries, and that was the headspace that she was in for the day before. Did you discover or look into whether she had a history of depression or she'd had suicidal thoughts? Was that something that you were able to kind of discern?
Here's the thing, and I want to be careful, again, out of respect for the family, because 1, I did not know Rebecca personally. 2, I am not a forensic psychologist. 3, what I have is very minimal information, but we did obtain that journal entry. And in that journal entry, if I were to just read it as someone who didn't know who wrote it, the person that wrote that journal entry did not seem like someone who was happy with where they were in life at that point. There was nothing in there that was suggestive they were going to take their own life, but it was someone who was not content with the current status of their relationship with their significant other. And what else was interesting about that letter, we talked about writing in third person. Rebecca was a beautiful writer. She wrote almost like in a biblical way. That's how she wrote. So this letter, in comparison to that writing, it did kind of line up. And now you take into consideration that here's a woman who's not happy with the current status of her relationship with her husband. She wants more. This husband relies on her to watch his son while he's playing tennis. An hour or two later, his son is in a coma and probably going to die. What do you think the conversation was between them two later that evening? Because again, this is speculation, but who do you think he's going to hold responsible for the death of his son? Not the Razor scooter. It's going to be Rebecca. And I wasn't on that conversation, but I can only imagine if it were me, the emotion that I would have had towards her in that moment if we were already on kind of rocky terms. I'm not saying they were on the verge of divorce, but from her words personally, it was not exactly where they wanted to be.
And there would be a sense of responsibility no matter who you were.
1,000%.
Just because she was the adult in the house. And I'm interested in Jonah because he's the connecting string between those two people. So we have 2 deaths in essentially three or 4 days.
Yes.
Was he ever a suspect?
He was not a suspect. I believe there was multiple witnesses at the tennis court, probably cameras. There were multiple cameras at the hospital. I'll even take it a step further. I mean, this is the problem that I have with, again, I'm not going to say certain names, but individuals, when the lawsuits first came out, Jonah Shacknai was a main suspect. It was alleged that she sat on the bed while whoever killed Rebecca hung her body over the porch. She was a main suspect by a specific lawyer involved in this case. Well, what came out is there was multiple camera angles at the hospital of Dina being there during that time, and that lawyer had to come out and publicly apologize. So I believe he was never a suspect for the simple reason of the sheriff's department was quickly able to track down his whereabouts through witness testimony and video surveillance. And you can't be at 2 places at once, right? So I don't think he was ever a suspect in the sense that he physically did it, but there was speculation, and there's still speculation among many people that either he could have been involved in planning the murder of Rebecca Zahau, not necessarily Max, or like I said earlier, there was somebody out there in this pharmaceutical industry, a lot of money, millions of dollars involved, billions of dollars, and someone was getting back at Jonah through his child and ultimately his wife.
And while Rebecca's death was first ruled a suicide, that started to come into question, didn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, immediately by the family, and they actually brought a team in and had them reinvestigate the whole case. Impartial investigators, different from the first one, and they came to the same conclusion as well.
And how was Adam then implicated? Because there was sort of a suit brought against him specifically,
That's right.
Wasn't there?
That's right. It was for millions of dollars from the Zahau family.
And what suggestion did they have, or did they have any evidence that would suggest that he had something to do with it?
Well, first off, he was there. His motive would have obviously been, this woman is the reason my nephew's dead now. So he has means, motive. They found that he had been watching some type of pornographic material on his computer earlier that morning or that night that involved bondage and involved Asian porn. Rebecca Zahau was Asian. For me, and I'm sure if they were sitting here, they'd tell you something different, but the main thing I got from it was not anything that implicated Adam Shacknai directly, but the lack of evidence implicated him. Let me dive a little deeper. The knots to her hands and to her feet, they were described as nautical in nature, nautical knots that would have to have been done by somebody who had experience in that type of knot tying. As I said earlier, Adam Shacknai was a tugboat captain. Coincidence? Maybe. I can tell you that I don't have any knot experience whatsoever, and I was able to replicate those knots in about 8 minutes after being shown one time, and I was able to put those knots on myself and cinch them down with no problem. The other issue was some of the forensic evidence surrounding Rebecca. He said he grabbed a knife. Adam Shacknai said he grabbed a knife to cut her down, and yet none of his fingerprints were on that knife. He said that he used a table to cut her down, but the table was missing one of its legs. There was no DNA or trace evidence from Adam in the room. There was no DNA trace evidence from anybody else in the room. A lot of it was based on physics, how she was thrown over the railing. They said that basically the way that she went over the railing, you would have expected to see something more significant if she had tossed herself over. There wasn't. There were multiple abrasions to the top of her head that wouldn't have been seen unless you actually conducted an autopsy under the scalp. There were 4 distinct abrasions that you wouldn't expect to find if somebody threw themselves over a railing. Then there was the hyoid bone, okay? The hyoid bone in Rebecca Zahau was broken. Hyoid bones being broken is usually suggestive of manual strangulation, not a hanging. So all of these circumstances, the totality of circumstances here in Rebecca's family's opinion is more suggestive of a homicide and not a suicide. Now, to quickly combat that, the hyoid bone, yes, mostly manual strangulation, but if you have a rope cinching down on your throat for an extended period of time, I believe that could cause the bone to break as well. Again, not a forensic pathologist. What we learned is that on the railing, the balcony itself, you could actually see from the dust that was on the balcony, you could see the footprints, Rebecca Zahau's footprints, kind of skipping together towards it. There was like 3 sets of prints, and it was indicative of someone's legs being tied together. On the railing itself, there was dust, but in the one specific area, the dust was missing, which again was suggestive of her leaning on the railing and then falling over, as opposed to someone throwing her over. And then the most important piece of information, the marks on her head, right? Could somebody have struck her head, knocked her unconscious, tied her up, and then thrown her over? That's the big question. We brought in a stunt woman who was the same size and weight as Rebecca Zahau. We had her go up on top of a recreated balcony with a railing that would be the exact height of the railing at the Coronado mansion, the Spreckles mansion. And we had that woman put her hands behind her back, tie them in a fashion, and then fall over the railing 3 separate times with slow motion, high-res cameras. Exactly the way that Rebecca Zahau would have done it. And on all 3 occasions, before going over to the ground, the top of her head in those exact locations struck the railing because that's the force needed to flip her legs over. And because the railing was ornate and had these specific patterns, they would have created those indentations that you saw on the top of her head. So one of the things that was their biggest piece of evidence, we kind of explained in a way forensically, scientifically, that would suggest it was a natural occurrence. And I can say it now, but the sheriff's department, after our show aired, actually reached out to us for that video footage because of how significant it was. They hadn't done it yet. So we submitted that.
Suspicion by investigators immediately falls on Adam Shacknai.
Look straight ahead.
To remove suspicion, Shacknai agrees to take a police lie detector test the very day he found Rebecca's body.
Regarding the death of Rebecca, did you yourself do anything to her that resulted in her death?
No.
Shacknai neither passes nor fails the test.
You could have done a whole lot worse on the test. Could have done a whole lot better, too, but based on what I've got here, we're kind of in that inconclusive range, which really doesn't bother me that much.
The extra question, I suppose, is about the fact that she was naked. There were experts that you spoke to who said that in all their careers, they had never seen a suicide of a woman where she was found without any clothes on. What did you guys make of that? What's the explanation as to why she might have done that?
Not a forensic psychologist, not someone who specializes in that, but Dr. Mohandi did extensive amount of research on it. And there is an actual journal out there that talks about, it's not a common thing. Let's first put that out there. It's not something that happens often.
And her friends did say that she was quite conservative.
Yes.
That was an interesting point.
Absolutely. None of it lines up with what she would have done. But at the end of the day, does it ever line up why someone would kill themselves? You know, it doesn't. It doesn't make sense to people in most cases. There are cases I do every day where the number one case that I get is my cousin, you know, the cops ruled my cousin's death as suicide. I don't believe they would have killed themselves. Nobody wants to believe it, rightfully so. And I don't expect them to, but
because it doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't make sense. Why, you know, what type of place do you have to be in to get there? It's a terrible thing to think about. As far as her being naked, the first thing I have to acknowledge as an investigator is just because I'm an investigator doesn't mean I can give you the answers to every question, right? And I'd be a fool if I sat here and told you I have an answer for everything. Some things just go unexplained. And the reality is, I don't know why she would have been naked if she had killed herself. My only guess would have been she was a religious person. It was a way of cleansing herself. And again, I'm not a psychologist, but I have to assume that the psychological state that she was in that moment, realizing that her possible lack of awareness of what was going on in the house may have resulted in the death of a child that she loved. Make no mistake about it. They may not have been blood related, but that was her son. And he was no longer there because she wasn't paying attention, allegedly. And now, on top of losing her son, she has a husband who she loves, who's probably indicated to her that when this is all said and done, they're over. And she's going to go back to the life she lived before she was living in mansions and riding boats and doing all these things. I don't think the material things mattered to her. But again, this is a complete shock and a change of your entire life in a matter of hours. So for us to speculate on her psychological state in that moment, I don't think we're qualified to do so. Listen, when people have a hypothermic reaction, a lot of people who die of hypothermia, they're found without their clothes on. It's completely contrary to what you would think, but what happens is right before they die, they feel like they're hot. Again, what I'm saying is some things go unexplained. I don't know why she did it. A lot of people gave us a lot of heat for our opinions on it, and I respect it. I'm never going to tell you what you want to hear. I'm going to tell you what I think, and that's what I thought. I will tell you that her being naked was perplexing to me, but I will say that anyone who takes 10 seconds can look up, there's a journal out there regarding suicides, and although it's not common, it does occur where males and females strip down naked before killing themselves, especially in a religious sense.
And what was the explanation for the message? Because the conclusion you came to, I thought was particularly fascinating because it was an angle I wouldn't have considered.
Again, it goes back to being religious. There's a lot of people who don't agree with us, but I think she was talking to God. And I think she was talking to God because I respect Chris Mohandi's opinion. The way it was explained to me, it makes sense. I think she was at a moment where she knew what she was going to do and she knew who she was about to meet, and it wasn't anybody on this earth. And I think the way she wrote in the past prior to that was that was the way she wrote to God. And I think that was her saying, you know, she saved him. Can you save her? Again, I'm not in her head, but I think it was her talking to God. I don't know who else she would have written that to. There's a lot of people that believe there's a scenario where she was writing that to Jonah. And it was kind of like her last at him because ultimately what was about to happen was his fault. But again, I don't like to say those things because, again, I'm going to go on the tangible things that I can assess. I don't like putting words in people's mouths or assuming what they felt at the moment because the reality is I didn't know Rebecca. So I have to stay objective. And for me to put in, into theory what I think she was thinking at that time, who am I? Nobody could.
Rebecca Zahau's sister says she's far from convinced Rebecca killed herself. She told 10 News this.
You will not find anybody in Becky's life who will come and say or ever remember Becky talking about suicide.
Then there's this message. She saved him. Can he save her? It was found on this door inside the mansion after Zahau's body was found. As for what it means, that's still a complete mystery to the Zahaus and their attorney.
Her family says it's not her handwriting. They looked at it. They've seen it. They said it's not her handwriting. What's meant by that could be anybody's guess. The police department told me they thought it meant that she was suicidal. I don't know how you conclude that, but that's what they've said.
Even with all that evidence, investigators can't say exactly what happened.
No one witnessed this event. We don't know exactly how this event occurred. We don't know in what order things were done. The only person who can answer that, unfortunately, is deceased.
So with all that evidence that you guys sifted through, and you spoke to a lot of experts, and as you say, it wasn't about theorising what someone might have thought or felt, what conclusions did you come to in terms of what happened to Max and what happened to Rebecca? What is your sort of timeline of what happened?
I believe that Max's death was an accident. I believe it basically exactly what the evidence suggests is what happened. I believe he was at the house. He was being a typical boy riding a scooter. Rebecca was probably preoccupied doing something which we are all guilty of. We all do that. And she probably wasn't paying attention at that moment. And he went over the railing and she did what she could to save him. And I will say that her actions probably resulted in him making it to the hospital. I think that she was in a place with Jonah that may have not have been as good as it may have looked to people on the outside. And I think Jonah was very upset with her when they spoke later that day, and probably even just through his expressions and his mannerisms gave her an indication that he was holding her responsible for what had happened. And I think that with some people, you know, thinking that you may be the reason that your son's dead or your stepson's dead, that's too much for some people. And her being biblical and realizing that her life was never going to be the life she wanted with Jonah or anyone else for that matter, on top of losing a stepson, I think she made a decision that she felt was best for her. As far as Adam's concerned, there was a civil lawsuit that was filed against him. It was for millions. They did find him liable in that court, but the threshold for evidence in a civil matter is a lot less than a criminal matter. And I will say that this wasn't as publicized, but one, the sheriff's department, because of that civil trial, reinvestigated the case again for a third time. And they had, again, a whole new set of investigators, many female investigators. That was one of the critiques they had in the past. They all came to the same conclusion, and mind you, they have access to everything. And there was actually a settlement in that case. They never got the money that they had originally went for. There was a settlement outside of court, I believe for $600,000. So for me personally, and this is my opinion, if I felt that someone had killed my brother or sister, I'm not taking any settlement. That's just me. I'm not going to settle for that. But that's what they did, and that's what they did for their family, and I respect it. But I will say this, and I won't say the person's name because I'm sure I'll be talking to them again in the future. I did have a woman who was a part of the forensic team directly involved with this case. And she reached out to me, and I know her information. We talked a lot. And she said to me, I've never come out and said this, but I'm retired now. And I want you to know that everything you put in the show is exactly the way the evidence was laid out and how we found it. The bottom line was this. If you were to think that Adam Shacknai killed her and he wiped away his DNA, this is a true crime podcast. There's one thing we all know, right? If I'm going to wipe away the DNA of my fingerprints or my blood or my hair from this surface, I can do that. But you know what I can't do? I can't be selective on what DNA I wipe away. So if I'm wiping it away, it's all of it. And the reality is that Rebecca's DNA was found on the rope, was found on a lot of the items that you would have expected to find the suspects on. And yet you found nothing. Their explanation will be gloves. That's what the other side would tell you. There's always an explanation. And who knows, maybe they're right. But in my professional opinion, that's what I believe happened.
That's fascinating. And it's one of those crimes that I think will always capture people's imaginations because of the possibilities and what appears to be a series of coincidences.
Yeah. And that happens sometimes. You know, sometimes it may look suspicious, but at the end of the day, it's exactly what it is. You know, you can't look too deep into it. Coronado Island and the Spreckles Mansion, I mean, there's people everywhere. I was there. The beach is everywhere. To think that someone went into that house and committed that crime and nobody saw or heard anything, I don't believe it. And Adam Shacknai, and I can say this publicly, you know, he doesn't seem like he's a genius to me. I don't see him as a contract killer. I think if he did it, he would have made a mistake. Something. Trace evidence. It could have been a piece of hair from his head. It could have been a fingerprint on the wall. It could have been him leaving the gloves that he used, something. To think that this guy who I saw in that interview committed the perfect murder, I don't buy it. I don't buy it.
I think you've left viewers very convinced as well after that episode.
Some. I get a lot of, trust me, you're being nice, because my Twitter, I work cases now and I still get, well, you also said Rebecca was committed suicide. It's one that sticks with it, but I can live with that. I can live with that because at the end of the day, you're going to know when I come out with an opinion, it's not because I know it's what the popular opinion is. If you disagree with me, that's fine. I can live with that. But I can promise you I'm always going to tell you how I really feel. And I think that says something because in the TV world today and even in podcasts, a lot of people tend to go with the popular opinion because they want to be liked.
And it's perhaps a more interesting or a more juicy headline.
Yeah, absolutely.
But this appears to be following the evidence as closely as you can, and the story forms itself.
We knew it. When Chris and I came to our conclusions on the last day, we said we're going to catch some heat for this. But there was just nothing there to, one, say she was killed, but more importantly, implicate someone who may be completely innocent. We have a responsibility to them as well. That's how the judicial system works. You're innocent until proven guilty. How can I go on camera or in any facet and say, oh, I believe he did it? Well, why do you believe he did it, Derrick? Well, he was there. He was there, and his forensics weren't found anywhere, so he had to have cleaned the scene. He must have, right? And there was knots. There was knots that I created in 8 minutes, but they were special nautical knots. They weren't. I can tell you right now they weren't. That is one thing I'm positive about. I don't think it made the episode, but I recreated those exact knots in under 8 minutes. I don't think it's one that anyone will ever be satisfied with. There's a lot of cases where they've been closed and there's an actual justification in it, and there are still people. Perfect example, I did the O.J. Simpson case. I concluded that, spoiler alert, O.J. Simpson was involved. There are still hundreds of thousands of people who believe O.J. didn't do it. And there's nothing that you or I can say that will change that. But that's the world we live in. And I think that's why true crime is so fascinating,
Exactly right. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you for having me.
Jonah Shacknai was asked to think back to July 2011, when he was summoned home after his 6-year-old son Max was terribly injured in a fall from a staircase landing.
I saw my son Max laying on the ground near the front door, being attended by some paramedics.
And was Rebecca there?
She was.
His girlfriend, Rebecca Zahau, was with Max when he fell. She had gone back home from the hospital when Jonah and his ex-wife Dina met with a doctor.
Dr. Peterson was unusually direct, inappropriately direct, and he basically volunteered that he'd been doing this for 30 years, that Max's injuries were similar to what he would see in a drowning, and that the best case scenario if Max survived was that he would never walk or talk again.
His grief worsened the next morning when his brother Adam called to tell him that Rebecca was dead, hanged from a balcony at their home, the famous Spreckles mansion in Coronado.
I couldn't believe it. My son was fighting for his life in a hospital, and the idea that Rebecca was now gone, it was unfathomable.
Derrick Levasseur's investigation into the death of Rebecca Zahau is explored in the series Breaking Homicide on the Investigation channel, available on Foxtel in Australia. To find out where you can watch the series in your part of the world, just follow the link in the description of this episode. For further reading on this case, as well as photos and profiles on the people of interest in this investigation, head to our closed Facebook group. Just search True Crime Conversations on Facebook. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens, and produced and edited by Elise Cooper. Don't forget to email us with any of your thoughts on our episodes, or maybe cases you'd like to hear explored, by emailing truecrime@mamamia.com.au.